there's a question as to the dating of when the various books of the Christian Bible were written, and it's a little bit deceptive because anyone that opens up a Christian Bible, a New Testament, you're first hit with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then only afterwards do you get to the letters of Paul. And what we seem to know fairly clearly is that the letters of Paul were composed prior to the Gospels, meaning Paul is writing, and basically in around the year 55 to somewhere in the 60s. And most scholars believe that the first gospel written was Mark around the year 70.
Welcome to TaNaCh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingston, Texas, USA, another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with our long-lost sweet Rebbe, Michael Skobac. Welcome back. It's always a delight and a pleasure to have you with us, so thank you for joining us. I figured I'd give you that last boost of powerful boom to let you know how much we miss you.
I jumped out of my seat.
That's funny. Oh, wow.
It's been a long time.
It's been
a long time.
It has been a minute. Yes, sir. So we are doing, we're into John. We made it. John chapter 1. How interesting.
You know, it's taken us a very long time to get here. I think we started about 10 years ago, maybe. Mm-hmm. And I had a lot less gray in my beard.
So did I.
And for those who were joining us late, what we did was we went through, I'm not sure how long it took, maybe a year. We went through the Gospel of Matthew. And then we decided that since we spent about a year going through the life story of Jesus, we didn't want to then go through Mark and Luke and John. So we went from Matthew to Acts. And over the course of about, I don't know, 8 years, I'm not sure exactly how long. It took us a long time. We went straight from Acts all the way through to, no, not 8 years, but maybe 6 years. We went through Acts through the end of Revelation. And then we doubled back and we then covered Mark and Luke. And now we have just one. I remember there was a short story when I was a kid. What was it called? And then there was none. Right? So 10 Little Indians or whatever was.
Yeah.
So we have one book left.
Yep.
That's it. It's just one soldier standing in the fort. And so we're going to start now the Gospel of John. And,
awesome.
You know, we've spoken about this a few times. I'm not sure what we're going to do after we finish John. We'll make a little bit of a party.
Yes,
and we'll
that would be great.
That would be. Figure out who our next victim is.
Yeah, I have some pretty good ideas at what directions I want to go. That's for sure. So
we'll have to have a powwow.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So anyway, we'll start John today.
Okay.
And I think as I told you, the first chapter of John is somewhat of a minefield, and so usually we've covered in each show one chapter, but it's not going to be feasible. We're going to probably spend at least 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks on this first chapter of John, and then we'll be able to, you know, move at more normal speed. So I guess we can get started.
Let's do it. I got you queued up right now. Yes, sir.
That's what I think. I forget his name. There was someone that was executed in Texas. I forget this guy that was executed. And I think that's what he said to the executioners. He said, "Let's do it." At the end. After his last meal, he said,
Wow.
"Let's do it."
That's crazy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's do it. Let's do it with John. Let's do him. All right. Take it away.
So, so most scholars, they maintain that John was the latest gospel written, meaning that there's a question as to the dating of when the various books of the Christian Bible were written. And it's a little bit deceptive because anyone that opens up a Christian Bible, a New Testament, you're first hit with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then only afterwards do you get to the letters of Paul. And what we seem to know fairly clearly is that the letters of Paul were composed prior to the Gospels, meaning Paul is writing and basically in around the year 55 to somewhere in the 60s. And most scholars believe that the first gospel written was Mark around the year 70. And they date Matthew to approximately the year 80 and Luke to approximately the year 90. And then John is viewed as the last gospel, the latest one written around the year 100. Some people say 90, some people say 110. So I'll split the difference and say that he's written around the year 100, about 70 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, who wrote this book? Who wrote the Gospel of John? So again, the Gospels are written anonymously, meaning that we have what are known as the seven uh, definite letters of Paul. There are seven letters that we know pretty clearly that Paul wrote. There are six other letters that are not so clear, possibly altogether 13 letters written by Paul, but the Gospels are written anonymously. There's no attachment of any authorship to the Gospels. And what you have basically is church tradition, what the church has traditionally believed to be the case. So traditionally, it's thought that it was John, the son of Zebedee, who was one of the first apostles of Jesus, who is the author of the Gospel of John. But it's not so simple because if you assume it's hard to know when John became an apostle, but he probably wasn't just bar mitzvah. He probably wasn't just, a kid. So if we assume he was, let's say, 20 years old, because he's already out working, he's fishing, he's not a child anymore. So let's say he was 20 years old when he first meets Jesus. So he would be, if this is written 70 years after the crucifixion, about 90 years, about 90 years old. Back then, not many people lived that long. I mean, even today, people often don't hit 90. So it's hard to imagine that the Apostle John actually lived long enough to write the Gospel of John. And even if he did, the obvious question is why wait 70 years? Meaning that if it was important to compose a biography of Jesus, he had no idea that he was going to live this long. I mean, if he was saying to himself, well, when I'm 90 years old, I'll start writing it, he could have died when he was 85. So it's not so simple to just uh, say, sure, it was written by the Apostle John. It's possible, but again, it's not, to me, the most self-evident idea in the world. Um, some scholars believe that simply the author of this gospel is an anonymous Greek writer. So it's some Greek person, we don't know who it is. And, that would be, I guess, a more academic, scholarly uh, perspective rather than just a traditional church point of view. So, what's fascinating about John, and we'll see this as we go through the text, is that John is very much an outlier compared to the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic basically means that the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they present the biography of Jesus from a similar point of view. They're all written from a similar point of view. More or less, they tell the same stories in pretty much a similar sequence. Of course, Mark is shorter than Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke will elaborate a bit more. There'll be more material in Matthew and Luke. But for the most part, Mark, Matthew, and Luke tell pretty much the same story. And so they're referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. They are basically Gospels that are seeing the story of Jesus from pretty much the same perspective. John does not fit in. It's like that song from Sesame Street. I was too old to watch the show, but I had a younger brother, 15 years younger than me. So I remember when he was growing up, I heard these songs all the time. And one of these things doesn't belong here was one of the songs I kept on hearing over and over again. So when you think of one of these things doesn't belong here, one of these things not quite the same, so that's the Gospel of John. It's very different than the other three Gospels. So I'll just mention, by way of introduction, a few of the differences. We could spend hours going through a more detailed listing of the differences between John and the synoptics. First of all, the synoptic gospels all have basically an origin story of Jesus going back to his infancy. They trace, at least in Matthew and in Luke, they trace the genealogy of Jesus, trying to show that he descends from King David. And uh, they mention the parents of Jesus, and a few places mention the virgin birth of Jesus. And then again, in various gospels, you'll find what happens in the beginning of his life. In Matthew, they speak about a flight to Egypt. He has to get away from the intended massacre of all the children, where he's born and all the surrounding cities. And then they describe in another gospel the long journey he has to take to Beit Lechem because the census is being taken there. But you have all these stories in the Synoptic Gospels about the infancy, the birth, the early years of Jesus, the wise men, the miracles, all these famous stories. John has none of this. The Gospel of John has none of this, as we'll see tonight or today. A second thing, which may or may not be an issue, it's not clear, is the chronology of these various Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels, in their recounting the life of Jesus, basically after he begins his ministry, the Synoptic Gospels mention only one Passover, only speak about one Passover in the ministry of Jesus. The Gospel of John mentions at least three Passovers. So it's possible that we have a different perspective here. That according to the synoptics, possibly you could say that the ministry of Jesus lasts 1 year, more or less 1 year, and that the ministry of Jesus, as presented in the Gospel of John, lasts for at least 3 years. So, what has happened among mainstream Christians is that they always try to harmonize the Gospels. They try somehow to harmonize John with the Synoptic Gospels, and the predominant view among most Christians is that the ministry of Jesus lasted between 3 and 3.5 years. Whether they are convincing in their ability to harmonize John with the other three, I'll leave that up for other people to decide. But basically, you could find this possible discrepancy between John and the synoptics. Another thing which is very interesting is that in the synoptic gospels, Jesus teaches frequently through the medium of parables. He uses parables in his teachings. And these parables are absent in the Gospel of John. That's very peculiar. It's very strange. It's a major feature in the Synoptic Gospels. His stories, his parables, his teaching parables, they just don't appear. They're absent in the Gospel of John. Um, Another thing that it's worth thinking about is that up until this point, in our studies, as I mentioned, we've gone through every book, every letter, every epistle of the Greek scriptures except for the Gospel of John. We've covered the entire New Testament except for the Gospel of John. And up until this point, we've seen that virtually every text, with only a few pretty murky exceptions, distinguishes between Jesus and God. John is unique in his full frontal advocacy of the divinity of Jesus. He pretty much comes out and puts it right out there that Jesus is God. This is something that not only is not said elsewhere, but it's repudiated, as we've seen elsewhere. There's a constant trend to distinguish between Jesus and God. And the traditional Christian apologetic way of defending this by saying, well, sometimes the Gospels speak about Jesus, the human being, and sometimes they speak about Jesus, the divine being. It doesn't really satisfy. Um, and here we see it's unapologetic that John comes straight out right in this first chapter declaring Jesus to be God. Pretty much so. So that's a significant difference. Also, it's interesting that in the Synoptic Gospels, the adversaries of Jesus are described as the elders, the scribes, the chief priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. But in John, it becomes the Jews, the Jews. Um, it's pretty sinister because one of the questions that is always asked is whether the Christian Bible is anti-Semitic, as an anti-Semitic text. Um, and you certainly have passages that seem that way, that certainly point in that direction. You have plenty of them in Matthew, but John also has a lot of really problematic texts. And the idea that the adversaries of Jesus are simply referred to as the Jews is interesting. It's significant in terms of what makes John different. And of course, there are many other stylistic differences between John and the other Gospels. So I don't want to spend too much time in this introduction. Let's just try to dive into the text itself. So, verse 1 of John is a very famous verse, and it reads like this: In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, this is what is referred to as the beginning of John's prologue in the first 18 verses of chapter 1. The first 18 verses are pretty much set apart from the rest of chapter 1 as what you could call what is referred to as his prologue. And basically, this prologue is theology written in poetic style. It's somewhat of a poetic style, and it seeks to establish the divinity of Jesus. That is really the subtext of what's going on. And although somewhat indirect, it is written in a style that is somewhat indirect. It is fairly obvious what the author of the Gospel of John is trying to convey. So the problem, of course, is that John here is totally out of step with the crisp and unambiguous theology of monotheism that we find in the TaNaCh. The TaNaCh basically portrays God as, in terms of being an absolute unity, and the TaNaCh is fierce in its absolute monotheism. And here we find the Gospel of John beginning out of the starting gate that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, it's a very, very puzzling passage, but something is off here. Something definitely seems off. Because there was a being that was with God prior to the creation of the world. And that being that was with God was God. Now, it's very hard to wrap your head around this, but that's what John is saying. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, John speaks about this term, the Word, being with God, and the Word being God. In Hebrew, this would be ha-davar. In Hebrew, word is davar. The word is ha-davar. The word ha-davar. And what is John saying? John is saying that the word, or ha-davar, was in the beginning, and the word was with God. Now, it's very important to clarify that we don't find this Hebrew word anywhere in the creation story of Genesis. Again, John is starting off by telling us that what was in the beginning? The Word. And this Word was with God in the beginning. And the Hebrew would be ha-davar. So if this Word was with God in the beginning, you would expect that if you went back to Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, you'd find this Hebrew word, which is ha-davar, Hebrew for the word. But it never occurs. You will not find it in the creation story of Genesis. Simply does not appear. Now, in Genesis, everything is created through God's speech. God's speech expresses his will. So when God says, "Let there be light," the Bible is telling us that it was God's will for light to be created. And that's all it took. All it takes for God to bring something into existence is to will that thing to come into existence. God thinks about it, God wants it to happen, and it happens. And the way the Bible conveys that process is by telling us that God spoke. God spoke. God said, let there be light. All that is telling us is that this was an expression of God's will. We don't have to assume that God has lips and a mouth and vocal cords and lungs, that he spoke and you heard a loud booming voice back then which said, let there be light. What the Bible is saying, in terms for us to understand, is that this is the will of God that is conveyed to us through divine speech. When God says, let there be light, or let there be trees, or let there be crocodiles, it's basically telling us that this was the divine will. This was God's will. And once God wills something, once God simply wants it to happen, it happens. God doesn't even have to snap his fingers. It simply happens. It's interesting that our word that we use, or that not we, but it's been used for generations, that magicians use when they are going to materialize something, is abracadabra. Abracadabra basically comes from the Hebrew abera kedabera. I will create as I speak. That's what the magician does. The magician says these words, and presto changeo, there is a rabbit that comes out of the hat. But this is the way God created. It's at least the way God communicates to us. When God gives us a Bible describing the creation story, the Bible describes the creation as God speaking, let there be light, let there be trees. And there were trees, there was light. It's very important to state the obvious. In Genesis, God is depicted as acting totally alone. If you read Genesis chapter 1, there is absolutely no mention of any being that's with him, anything that's with him. In Genesis chapter 1, God is acting totally alone. And there is no mention of this term in Hebrew, hadavar, which in English is the word, or in Greek, logos. These words simply do not appear in the Hebrew Bible. So, if the text of Genesis says nothing about hadavar, the word, or anything being with God, where does John get these ideas from? Again, Christians often are very hung up on whether something is biblical or not. Well, here you have, at the very beginning of John's gospel, ideas that are not biblical. John speaks about the word that's there in the beginning, and that the word was with God. But in Genesis, absolutely nothing about the word being with God. So where does John get these ideas from? So many believe, and you'll find that many Christians write about this, that John got his ideas about the Logos, or again in English, the Word, a Jewish philosopher named Philo of Alexandria.
If you enjoy this channel and the content, and it has changed your life, or perhaps the life of a loved one or a close friend,
would you please consider supporting this work? You can click this link and it'll take you directly to my website with a donate button. Or there's a Patreon link and a mailing address for snail mail if you would prefer. If you do donate, please do me a favor and leave me a phone number where I can contact you and thank you properly. I hope you all have a wonderful 2025. Shalom.
From the Jewish philosopher named Philo of Alexandria. Now again, I just want to reiterate these terms so that we don't get confused. When we read the Christian Bible in English, it says the word, the word. But we know the Christian Bible was originally written in Greek. And there you'll find logos, logos, which in Hebrew is hadavar, the word. In Greek, the logos. In English, the word. So the question again is, where does John get this idea about the logos, or the word, being with God in the creation story, in the beginning of creation? So the commonly believed source is that John gets the idea from a Jewish philosopher named Philo of Alexandria. Now, as we're going to see, John may have borrowed some of Philo's language, but he very seriously distorted Philo's ideas. Now, it's interesting that Philo's life overlapped the life of Jesus. Philo was born in the year 20 BCE, 20 before the Common Era, and he died 70 years later in the year 50 CE, 50 of the Common Era. And it's important to understand that while Philo was a Jew, his philosophical orientation was primarily Hellenistic. He wasn't a traditional Jew. And traditional Jews have never studied Philo and his philosophical works. We have had plenty of Jewish philosophers over the course of history, and their philosophy had a specifically Jewish orientation. And those philosophers, like Saadia Gaon and Maimonides and many others, we study. They're coming from a Jewish perspective based upon Jewish sources, the Bible, the Midrash, the Talmud, etc. Philo, his orientation, although he was a Jew, was basically through the eyes of Hellenism. Hellenism was Greek thought, Greek philosophical thought. And his interest, what Philo was interested in doing, was to try and understand the Hebrew scriptures in light of Greek philosophical perspectives. That was the lens through which Philo tried to understand the Hebrew Bible. And primarily, I mean, we know that Greek philosophy is a wide field. Philo was primarily seeing the Hebrew scriptures through the perspectives of Plato and the Stoics. Now, what was central to Greek thinking was that the Greeks were not able to fathom how a totally transcendent an unknowable God could interact with a material universe. To the Greeks, these were just two realms that were unbridgeable. Unbridgeable. So to deal with this problem, to deal with the problem of how does a transcendent God relate to a material physical world, Philo employed the idea, the concept of the Logos, or the Word of God. And this idea is basically an intermediary between God and the physical created world. Again, for the Greeks, they cannot imagine God interacting directly, being involved directly with our low physical world. And so the idea of the Logos, or the Word, was a way of constructing, formulating an intermediary that would moderate, so to speak, between the transcendent God and the immanent physical world. For Philo, the Logos, or Word, is the rational principle bringing the universe into existence. It's a rational principle. It's the divine agent through which God interacts with creation. It is God's instrument, if you will, of creation and of governance of his creation. Philo's Logos, when Philo speaks about this idea of the Logos, it is an abstract philosophical concept. Again, it's an abstract philosophical concept and an impersonal force. A mediator, again, between God and the physical world. This idea of the Logos is similar to Plato's concept of the realm of forms or ideas as a blueprint for the material world. What does this mean? The Platonic idea of the realm of ideas or forms. So simply put, in our world, for example, we are familiar with what a table is. Every single one of us has had experience with tables. But there are many kinds of tables in the world, of differing design, of differing size, of differing shape, differing color, differing physical appearances. There are many, many, many different kinds of tables, if you think about it, over the course of history. But for Plato, there is the abstract idea of table, the abstract idea, the ideal or the form of a table. It's not physical. It's an ideal. It's a conceptual form of tableness, or we'd say in Judaism, table kite. It's the concept of what a table is. And this concept or idea is not physical, but it is the source and the root of the analog tables of various designs that we see in our world. And if you didn't have that, heavenly idea of a table, you wouldn't have tables in our world, in the physical world. So Philo's idea of the Logos is similar to this idea in Platonic philosophy of the forms or the ideals. It is basically the source and the root through which everything emerges in our physical world. So for Philo, the Logos is the blueprint, if you will, that is the archetype for creation. And this Logos is not a separate entity from God. It's not a separate being from God. Rather, it's more like an emanation or an extension of God's power, like you can compare it to the rays of the sun. The rays of the sun, it's basically part of the sun. It's an extension of the sun. It's not an exact analogy because, again, the sun is physical. God is not physical. But for Philo, the Logos is not a separate entity from God. It's an emanation or an extension of God's power. It's the vehicle that he uses, that God uses to create the world. Now, while Philo operated within the framework of biblical monotheism, Philo, even though he was oriented toward Greek philosophy, he didn't depart from the biblical idea of monotheism. The writer of John's Gospel appropriated the terminology of Philo, but greatly distorted the concepts. Again, in Philo, the Logos is the agent of creation. And John borrows this idea by identifying Jesus with the Logos and claiming that all things were made through him. That's verse 3 in this chapter. That all things were made through the Logos, who John identifies as Jesus. But as we see, when John personifies the Logos, the Word of God, as Jesus, he is sharply departing from Philo's abstract philosophical concept and principle. For Philo, again, the Logos is an abstract, impersonal concept. But John either misunderstands Philo or, probably more likely, purposefully reworks Philo's philosophical framework. Philo never personified the Logos as a divine being. Philo avoids anthropomorphizing the Logos and attributing personhood to it. And this is dramatically embraced by John. John personifies the Logos and gives it human form by identifying the Logos with Jesus of Nazareth. Now, when John goes further and presents Jesus as the incarnation of God, that God took on human form, John embraces an idea that would have been repugnant to Philo. Part of the impetus for the doctrine of the Logos for Philo was his view of the material world as vastly inferior to the spiritual. That's part of what motivated Philo to come up with this idea of the Logos. He couldn't see God as transcendent and purely spiritual having anything to do directly with the physical world. For Philo, there's no common ground between the physical and the spiritual. There's no common ground between the divine and the world. And this is why the Logos doctrine became for him, for Philo, the mediator between these two realms. The idea of the Logos becoming physical would have been impossible for Philo. It would have been inconceivable for Philo. So we have to remember that Philo took great care to avoid blurring the distinction between God and the Logos. For Philo, the Logos is a vehicle of God, clearly subordinate to God, and not to be confused with God. So when John declares that the Logos, the Word, was God, he is no longer operating within the framework of Philo's system of philosophy. Of course, Philo has no parallel to John's concept of Jesus being the Word of God who redeems the world from sin through his sacrificial death and resurrection. These ideas simply do not exist in Philo's philosophy. So John is clearly not rooted in the Torah and not rooted in Philo either. And just like today's Messianic Jews who appropriate and distort rabbinic literature for apologetic purposes, John may have borrowed some of Philo's language, but his theology diverges widely from Philo. Now, what is worth noting is that the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew word davar, again, davar in Hebrew is rendered as word in English, logos in Greek. In Aramaic, it is memra. And this term, memra, is used in the Aramaic translations of the TaNaCh in the exact opposite direction that John takes. Again, John uses the idea of the Logos as an off-ramp to get from a transcendent God to a God that takes on human form, a God that becomes physical. That's ultimately what John does. Through, again, using this tool, I wouldn't say tool, using the terminology of Philo. And again, only using the terminology, borrowing the term logos, but again, totally distorting how Philo understood the logos. But in the Aramaic translations of the TaNaCh, which are called the Targumim, or the Targum, singular, the Aramaic term, memra, which is again simply the Aramaic equivalent of logos, of davar, of word. The Targum uses this term, memra, to obviate any implication of divine anthropomorphism in the biblical text. So it's fascinating that where John uses the language of logos to be able to slide into first base and to come up with this idea of the incarnation of God into the human being, Jesus of Nazareth, who John refers to as the Logos, as the Word. The Aramaic translations of the TaNaCh, by the way, done by traditional Jews. Again, Philo was not a traditional Jew. Philo was someone who uses this concept of the Logos, the Word, basically to advance Hellenistic, Greek philosophical ideas. And unfortunately, John is able to manipulate these terms as a way of introducing his very, very non-biblical idea of the incarnation of God, even non-Philo and non-Platonic idea. But the Targumim are basically the product of very traditional Jews. Their agenda is to preserve traditional Jewish theology. And so what they want to do is use this idea of the memra, of the logos, of the word, to shield God from any possible misunderstandings based upon the anthropomorphisms that we find in the Bible. The term memra, again, simply Aramaic for logos or word, is consistently used to shield God from any association with physical form or human emotions. Because the Bible often uses anthropomorphic language, language that can be misconstrued. So, for example, we find in Genesis that God walks in the Garden of Eden. Well, if a person reads that, God walked in the Garden of Eden, a person could say in their mind, oh, well, God must have legs, physical legs, for him to walk. These are people that are just simply not understanding the meaning of the anthropomorphism. Because again, as the Talmud says, Dibra Torah B'Loshem B'nei Adam. The Torah is a document that's given to human beings to read, and therefore the Torah has to use the language of human beings. So when the Torah is describing God, the Torah will use the kind of language that human beings use. For example, if you read the book of Ezra, many times Ezra says that the hand of God was upon me. Now, I don't think a normal person is going to imagine that if they were there, they would have seen a massive hand emanating out of the heavens and putting itself on the head of Ezra. It's obviously not what the Bible means. It is a way that the Bible conveys the idea that Ezra felt supported by God. He felt that God was with him. And he says that by using this anthropomorphic language, that the hand of God was upon me. But the Bible has such language. The Bible speaks about, again, God walking in the Garden of Eden, or God redeeming Israel from Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or God seeing what people are doing. What do you mean God is seeing what people are doing? Does that mean God has eyes, that he wears glasses, that he uses a telescope? So again, people can easily misconstrue what the Bible means. You know, we live in a world today where anyone who spends any time on social media sees how easy it is for people to take things the wrong way. People seem primed to be able to do that. So the Targumim, the Aramaic translations of the Bible, were extremely concerned that people do not misconstrue, do not misunderstand what the Bible is saying. So in order to soften these anthropomorphisms in the Bible, the Targumim use the term memra, again, which is Aramaic for logos, or in English we would say the word, or in Hebrew davar. The Targumim use this term memra as a cushion, to make sure that people will not misunderstand the Hebrew of the Bible. So rather than say, as the Bible might say, God appeared, well, again, an unsophisticated person could assume that, well, now God can be seen. He's there. He appeared. So the Targum will say that the memra of God appeared. The memra of God wasn't God that appeared. It was this divine word, this logos, this memra of God that appeared. So I think we'll end here. I had really more that I wanted to share today, but I think it'll go too long, and I think it's a good place to stop.
Okay.
And God willing, next time we meet, we'll pick up, we'll probably do a little bit more introduction, or at least discussion of this first verse in John, and then hopefully in the second session, we'll be able to finish the prologue of John.
That sounds like a plan to me. You were right, though. It was very, very thick, full of stuff, no doubt. I don't mean that in a negatory way, like you were thinking. Maybe I did. Maybe it is full of. Anyway,
as long as you don't say that I'm thick.
Yeah, no. You are a lean, mean machine. All right. Well, guys, thank you all for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Thanks for all your activity. And the moderators and YouTube, thank you for everything you do. And we will see you, Hashem willing, same time, same place next week. So everybody should be well, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Shalom, everybody. Peace.
Have an awesome week. All the best.
Amen.
If you enjoy this channel and the content, and it has changed your life, or perhaps the life of a loved one or a close friend, would you please consider supporting this work? You can click this link and it'll take you directly to my website with the donate button. Or there's a Patreon link and a mailing address for snail mail if you would prefer. If you do donate, please do me a favor and leave me a phone number where I can contact you and thank you properly. I hope you all have a wonderful 2025. Shalom.